Let's see. All right, so my name's Alexis. I am the adult librarian over at Lit Library, and I just want to thank everyone for joining us tonight for this 3-part virtual discussion series on race and racism, brought to you by Lit Library in collaboration with Project R.E.A.L with the City of Rochester and the City of Canandaigua Equity and Diversity Task Force. These series will address how race shapes mental health and community, politics, and media. Each night will be led by different panelists, including faculty from area colleges and universities, activists, and authors. And for tonight, we have our Professor Ricky Price from Hobart William Smith, and we have Sim Covington from FLCC. And we have our moderator tonight, Tisha from Project R.E.A.L from the City of Rochester. And she will be going over the different rules for you tonight.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here on the behalf of the R.E.A.L initiative at the City of Rochester, and just to spend some time with Sim and Ricky. Like, this is going to be a great discussion. Now, I'm known for being a boundaries queen, so I love boundaries. They're great. And so some of the boundaries for tonight are, you'll see in the chat down there in the corner, I've put some rules. If you have a question, I want you to type question before your question so it's easier for me to see. Or if you have a comment, then you type comment before your comment, and then we'll be able to go through that. Some of you are probably used to kind of like the little blue hand, raising your hand. That's cool too, but I would rather just kind of regulate in the chat, and then we'll kind of voice for you what your comment and question is to our panelists, if that helps. That's the more equitable way of going about things. Do not forget, we have captions, right, for today. And so at the bottom, you can click close caption, and then you'll see at the bottom your captions are there at the bottom of your screen. So hopefully we're all set with our rules. Are y'all good with the rules? Can I get a thumbs up? Yay, enthusiastic consent. All right, back to y'all.
Is it on me? Am I going to go ahead and open up?
Yep, go for it, Sim.
So good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Sim Covington. I currently serve as the Chief Diversity Officer at Finger Lakes Community College, and I'm very excited to be here tonight. I'm going to take this moment to go ahead and share my screen. And just to make sure, can everyone see my screen? Can I get some type of validation? Yeah? All right.
I can see it.
So the first thing that I would like to do as I navigate is I want to give a shout out to our community partners, including Wood Library. In regards to doing this work, it's very important that we operate, or I operate, with a level of humility and continue to learn from others. I'm very happy that Wood Library has taken the initiative to put on this event. I'm very excited to be here tonight. Something that I really want to start the conversation about with is around the concept of psychological safety, being able to show and employ oneself without fear of negative consequences of self-image status or career. A lot of times, if you ask people, do you like when people lie to you? Most people are going to say no, but they don't really understand how they're contributing to an environment where others don't feel psychologically safe in being themselves. When people do not feel validated, that is going to create an environment where they feel the need to hide, right? And it's very important that people feel psychologically safe as they're navigating the world at large. A lot of times when it comes to people who are a part of marginalized communities, they have to operate with a level of hypervigilance by default of not feeling safe in the greater community. Given this geographic area, specifically Canandaigua, New York, which is where I reside, also working at a predominantly white institution, we make sure that we are proactive in making sure that our students feel welcomed at FLCC, and we have parameters and systems in place in order to support both their academic needs as well as their enrichment around student development. So for those of you who are not familiar, at the bottom we have Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So first starting with food, clothes, and shelter, which is your physiological needs. And as you see, the next one is feeling safe. When people feel safe, they can go up to feeling love and belonging, esteem, and being self-actualized. When you are self-actualized, it creates an opportunity where you can thrive. In regards to the mental health landscape, just a general snapshot, approximately 18% of US adults have diagnosable mental disorders. The reason I talk about psychological safety is because it's very important to know people who are in your family, outside of your family, people you work with, people you go to church with, people you see at the supermarket, people who are in your circle, people who are outside of your circle. If they do not feel psychologically safe, they are not going to disclose the truth. Right? So a lot of times when you set up parameters, when people actually feel like they can be themselves, they'll actually disclose things that may be going on with them. There are a variety of, something about myself is that my background's in counseling. I was seeing a gentleman for about a good 6-month period who would come to me every day on his lunch break. That's how severe his situation was, that he was in counseling daily. And he would see me every day during his lunch break. Yet his wife and his daughter were under the impression that he was at lunch, right? So even in the closest scenarios, his wife, his daughter, his family, he was not disclosing to them some of the mental things that he was going through because he did not feel psychologically safe. He felt like he would be judged. So once again, just reinforcing the whole concept of psychological safety. Mental behavior disorders among the leading causes, of disability in the US, mental disorders among the top most costly health conditions for adults, okay, just very quickly. And as we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's very important that I also take the time to talk about other aspects of diversity. Because of the narrative in this country, a lot of times when people think of diversity, they limit their definition of diversity to race. But diversity can also include ethnicity, but not limited to, let me say that, ethnicity, gender, religious affiliation, gender identity, socioeconomic status, age, political affiliation, physical ability, mental health diagnosis, veteran status, as well as sexual orientation. Here, I typically have participants, we don't have to do it right now, consider their own identity and thinking about the history of this country, consider whether or not they are a part of either a privileged or an oppressed group. As the U.S. population is continuing to become more diverse, by 2044, more than half of all Americans are going to belong to a minority group, any group other than non-Hispanic white alone. Okay. In regards to diversity and mental health, once again, depression in Hispanics and Black is more likely to be persistent. Minorities are more likely to be in high-need subpopulations areas. So this creates a situation where individuals who are coming from diverse backgrounds are also going to be dealing with other comorbid or overlapping issues, such as homelessness, residing in an institution, things along those lines. Typically, if an individual has 2 or more races, they are more likely to report any mental illness. I really want to pause there for a second, because based on my assessment, some of that may be coming from the fact that they constantly feel invalidated. They constantly feel like they have to go through identity issues based on the pressure that they receive from the external society, okay? Among adults with mental illness, 48% of whites receive mental health services compared to a lower percentage for Black and Hispanics. Whites are more likely to receive outpatient treatment at private therapist office, whereas Black and Hispanics are more likely to receive care from state mental health agencies. I think this is important to note because later on I'm also going to talk about the presence of law enforcement in the K-12 system relevant to mental health. For a lot of individuals who are coming from diverse backgrounds, the presence of law enforcement, whereas some people perceive it's coming as a form of safety, other people feel very much so threatened by it because they feel that they're raising people of color to be already acclimated to having some type of interaction with law enforcement that may not necessarily be positive. Something else that I'm going to talk about momentarily is the fact that a lot of times individuals who are coming from diverse background are more likely to be referred to the judicial system relevant to some type of infraction that may take place within the school system. Blacks are more likely to be hospitalized for mental illness than other racial groups. Inpatient mental services were used more frequently by Black adults than those reporting two or more races. Asians are less likely to use mental health services, and women are more likely to receive mental health services than men. In regards to gender norms, I think it's important to talk about the concept of women receiving or engaging in more mental health services. And I think a part of that is relevant to the messages that women receive: nurturing, upbringing, communication, whereas men are very often encouraged to bottle their feelings, not communicate, take it like a man. So I think a lot of the messages that we receive growing up is also going to influence our engagement in mental health services. There is a great organization. I want to give a very quick shout out to NCBI of Rochester in regards to the great work that they do. And the reason I want to bring them up is because in regards to NCBI of Rochester, in regards to NCBI of Rochester, one of the things that they teach us is that we get messages from a variety of places. One of those places being our family of origin. We also get messages from the media, so I'm very happy that Wood Library is going to be talking about race in the media later on this week. And we also get messages from our circle of influence. And those three main sources are going to really shape the way in which we see the world. People see life through the lens of their experience. And it's very important to understand that based on somebody's upbringing and the messages they receive, that is going to strongly influence how they navigate not only within their home, but also how they conceptualize and view things within the external community. Okay. Criminal justice in the K-12 system relevant to mental health. Blacks were only 50% as likely, as likely to receive psychiatric treatment compared to their white counterparts. So even if you have a similar situation, individuals who are coming from diverse backgrounds were not going to receive adequate treatment. Mental health problems are common among the criminal justice system, which is have a disproportionate representation of individuals from diverse background. For those of you who are not familiar with it, there is a great documentary out there called 13th. Right now it's available on Netflix. It's also available on YouTube for free. I think it's still free on YouTube. And it talks about how the criminal justice system, quite frankly, exploits individuals of color in order to support corporate America. I highly recommend this documentary. Approximately 50-75% of youth in juvenile systems meet the criteria for some type of mental health disorder. And one of the conversations that we were having before we started sharing with the greater audience tonight was the overlap between individuals who may be dealing with the judicial system as well as having either not being initially diagnosed or misdiagnosed. So one of the things that's also going on the national landscape is the call for mental health providers to be involved in the judicial process and the law enforcement process. And one of the recommendations that I have is that if the country moves this way, they definitely need to be strategic and intentional in regards to what that's going to look like. Minorities are more likely to end up in the juvenile justice system due to harsh disciplinary suspension. So a part of that goes back to implicit bias. So for those of you who are not familiar with Pavlov's dog, the best way I can describe it very quickly as we have this psychology lesson is the following. If every time I feed my dog, I ring a bell, well, let's start this way. If every time I feed my dog and pull the food out, the dog starts to slobber, right? And if every time I ring a bell, when I'm going to feed the dog, eventually when I ring the bell, the dog is going to slobber whether the food is present or not. The reason I bring this up is because, once again, as I talk about the messages that people receive, specifically in the media, if every time there is some type of negative connotation that's presented in the media, they show individuals who are coming from marginalized backgrounds, that's the messages that the greater community is going to receive, including individuals who work in law enforcement. It's important for people to have conversations about the biases that they have, their implicit as well as their explicit bias. Implicit bias is implying that you're operating at a level that you might not necessarily be aware of. Explicit bias is that you are fully aware of your intentions, okay? So in regards to the criminal justice system and mental health, The way that individuals are diagnosed or misdiagnosed, the level of treatment or lack thereof is very crucial in regards to individuals who are coming from diverse backgrounds. In addition to that, individuals who are coming from diverse backgrounds are more likely to have less access to mental health services. And it becomes a little bit more complex. If you're living in, quote unquote, a food desert or a poor community, your access to mental health may not be there. Certain things that we have seen with COVID-19, where people tend to take advantage, is with the assumption that by default of their level of luxury, for lack of a better word, or privilege, that everyone operates at that level, which is clearly not the case. So here I have a couple of barriers to care in regards to individuals who are coming from diverse backgrounds. The first one that I have is lack of insurance or underinsurance. Many racial ethnic diversity differences in mental health are confounded by income differences. Mental illness stigma, once again, goes back to psychological safety. A lot of times people will deflect as opposed to actually talking about what's really going on with them. You may have somebody who give you a list of symptoms that they may be experiencing, but they may need a person who is coming with an objective perspective to help them identify that they may actually be depressed, right? Lack of diversity among mental health care providers. So when I walk through the door, am I going to walk into a room where I'm now speaking to somebody who understands or has a shared or similar lived experience? Lack of culturally competent providers, understanding my walk in life, how I navigate the world, the lens in which I operate. Language barriers. Distrust within the healthcare system, which is very common, a lack of availability or adequate referrals, transportation issues. I have something going on, how am I going to get there? A lot of times we have this conversation around copay. I had a great conversation with one of the counselors at FLCC, and she communicated to me that a lot of times the copay is even a burden for a lot of people. The belief that mental health treatment, quote unquote, doesn't work. And a lot of times when I get to that, something else I want to talk about, and this is very true across a variety of communities, because I just want to pause here. A lot of times when people are going through things, they may actually be dealing with some type of severe mental health issues, but they're using their circle or their friends and family to provide, for lack of a better word, informal counseling. And as long as they have that crutch, they're not necessarily going to adequate providers to provide them with the proper guidance that they need to navigate either outside of some type of crisis, or to start to select more healthy choices so that they can operate at an optimal level. Racism, bias, and discrimination within the treatment settings. So sometimes when individuals from diverse backgrounds are seeking mental health services, they have to now walk into the room and automatically feel the bias. So going back to what I started with around psychological safety, one of the things that is very much so important that people understand is the following. Just because something does not operate at an explicit level does not mean that it does not exist. And for a lot of people, that's their default response. If you cannot prove that whatever took place, then it doesn't exist. I'm very happy to let you know that that is very much so not true. I do not have to let an individual know explicitly, I don't like you, in order for them to feel that I have a problem with that. So in regards to these intangible aspects of discrimination, these are very real. I'll use myself as an example. So I always use my stats, and the reason I use my stats is because it's important for people to understand what they are going to experience when I walk in a room. So I'm 6'5", 300 pounds, African American. For some people, when I walk in a room, I may automatically cause them to have a sense of intimidation, even though I pose no threat. In regards to people, when they're dealing with that bias that may kick in because they automatically assume interferes with mental health services and whether or not a person will return, right? If you do not feel validated, you do not feel welcome. So one of the primary causes, excuse me, in regards to challenges around race and mental health is, quite frankly, implicit and explicit bias, the provider bias and stereotyping, negative experiences with the system, lack of inclusion in research and clinical trials. One of the most horrific examples of minorities being included in medical research would be the Tuskegee experiment. So once again, when the country is looking to have individuals participate in experiments that may be to their detriment, such as i.e. guinea pigs, that's okay. But when it comes to actually providing adequate health care for individuals who may be living with a psychiatric disorder, the country continues to fall short, quite frankly, specifically when it comes to diverse communities. Systematic racism creating barriers and compounding the issue. So there's 3 areas that I want to talk about very quickly. So though we're talking about mental health, which is subpar specifically for individuals from diverse background, for individuals who are also coming from diverse backgrounds and marginalized backgrounds, there's also inadequate educational systems. And after World War II, we saw the thing with redlining around housing. So all of these things compound the issues that these individuals are dealing with. You wake up in the morning and people feel like, well, I woke up, you woke up, I'm just going to navigate my day. But based on your social identity or your intersectionality, which would be the overlap of your social identities, that is going to have a profound influence not only on how you see the world, but how you are also perceived by others. In regards to what we're doing at FLCC, I'm very happy to say that we are working, or operating rather, at a level of high intentionality in regards to validating our students. So a couple of examples that we have is we address DEI in our classroom setting. So we bring on different presenters to teach our faculty and staff how to do that most effectively. We've also had our faculty and staff participate in teaching and learning in diverse classrooms offered through Cornell University. We also host DEI experts on ADA, UDL, as well as building more civility within the organization. We also hosted a Hispanic panel at our Geneva Campus Center. So once again, operating with a high level of intentionality. We had a veteran speaker because a lot of times veterans are coming back from combat, returning to civilian life, and it's having a severe impact on their mental health. Okay. In addition to that, our provost had a great relationship with an author of a book called Cognitive Bandwidth. And this book really talks about the level of mental fortitude or contributions that individuals have to engage in order to navigate a world that is plagued with racism, sexism, and poverty. So whereas one individual may just be going to class, they're not processing what another individual who's coming from a diverse background may be dealing with at a predominantly white institution. So it's important to, one, have those conversations, to talk about implicit bias. Something else that's very important to talk about when it comes to mental health is what may be also impacting faculty and staff per se at the institution. Because if you're being evaluated, how are teachers' evaluations being assessed based on individuals who are coming from diverse backgrounds? With the heightened level of activism that's currently taking place right now in Rochester, the impetus for the recent events was clearly by default of an individual who was living with mental illness. I'm very happy to say that in the city of Canandaigua, they have created a police reform committee to start having conversations about what steps can law enforcement take to make sure that its processes are, one, objective, as well as being able to make proper assessments when they're showing up to whatever scene that they may show up to. A lot of times, things that may be going on with an individual, there may be some overlap. One of the things that I talked about earlier is that when law enforcement shows up, they may see an individual engaging in some type of behavior, and they may automatically assume that the person is under the influence, right? And it was very quickly shared with me, which I wholeheartedly agree, that sometimes when it comes to individuals who may be under the influence, they may also be the comorbidity of that person also dealing with some type of mental health issue as well. So very quickly, some things that I think that can take place in order to create some great systematic change. One, learn about individual as well as systematic racism. The true narrative of this country includes certain parts that make people uncomfortable. That includes colonization, racism, Jim Crow laws, etc. That's the real history of this country that continues to plague some of the systems that we have in place. Learn about your own biases. I highly recommend, for those of you who are not aware of your own biases, that you take one or several of the IATs, implicit association tests offered through Harvard University. It gives you some feedback in regards to where your biases may lie. Explore strategies to support those who are least likely to seek and receive treatment. There also needs to be anti-stigma campaigns in minority communities. Continue cultural competency training for law enforcement and mental health practitioners. This is crucial, right? A lot of times when I'm speaking to law enforcement professionals and having conversations with them, the main thing that may be coming from their perspective is that based on my training, I'm expected to show up and de-escalate the situation. And I think it's important to have conversations that if you're interacting with someone who is not responding to some type of verbal command, what are some other steps or tactics that you can instill or put in place to make sure that things don't lead to the tragedy that we may see happening across this country? Encourage mental health organizations to include minorities on staff or board of directors. This is crucial. A lot of times when you look at nonprofit organizations, the board of directors are not diverse, period, the end. So by default of that, there's a significant aspect of diversity, equity, inclusion that's missing from the conversation. Conduct community forums to assess the needs of your constituents. Write a call to your local legislator, speak to others on behalf of minority mental health. So I just wanted to take some time very quickly to share some of the things that's going on with individuals who are coming from diverse backgrounds. And I'm all set. I wanted to pass the ball to Ricky to let him share, and then we'll open up the floor for questions.
Great. Thanks, Sim, so much. What you just presented so much in your presentation really sets up what I want to talk about a little bit. I think you really made the fabric of our everyday world really visible and made it impossible to deny the reality of politics and life today. So thank you for your talk. That was really wonderful. I also want to thank Alexis and Project R.E.A.L for inviting me to talk today. And if there's one thing I know I love in this world, it's librarians. So thank you for your work, Alexis. And Letitia, it's also really, really nice to meet you in the work of Project R.E.A.L. So thank you very, very much for inviting me here today. So like I said, my name is Ricky Price. I'm a visiting assistant professor at Hobart and William Smith. And my work, it looks at the history of HIV/AIDS policy and activism. What I do is I look at federal science institutions like the Centers for Disease Control and the National Institutes for Health. And I try to understand the way that health policy is created and how it can be transformed. And so we talk a lot about institutional and systemic racism. And so for me as a policy scholar, I want to look at what policies, practices, rules, interpretations, memos, reports, etc., that reproduce healthcare inequalities that structure them into our daily lives and in our laws. So what I'm going to walk through tonight are some of the connections and some of the differences between the history of HIV and COVID, and think about how both of these epidemics force us to think critically about what sort of community and mental health models we might be able to create that can help people live longer, healthier lives. And so one of the things that I found in my research on HIV/AIDS is that institutional practices that we can observe, that we can locate, that we can measure, led to the shepherding of HIV/AIDS into poorer communities, into Black and brown communities, and to communities disconnected from healthcare. And that the specific containment strategy that we've developed to control AIDS, absent a vaccine or a cure, ensured through public health policy that only those with the least access to healthcare, with the most interaction with the carceral state, with the communities with the least investment in education and health services, would be the ones that couldn't afford the daily therapies that now make living with HIV chronic rather than terminal. So from this perspective, it's quite obvious why HIV seemingly migrated from white, affluent, gay, urban communities in the 80s to where the epidemic is now in the rural South, where 50% of queer and Black Latinx men are likely to become HIV positive, where Black women without access to healthcare represent the American epicenter of the ongoing HIV/AIDS crisis, and where HIV/AIDS is one of the leading causes of death for women globally of reproductive age, which is 14 to 44, according to the World Health Organization. And that was before COVID, and we know COVID will exacerbate all of the existing epidemics we're currently fighting. And HIV and COVID are very different viruses. They're different biologically, they're different socially, and they're different politically. But what I want to talk about today is the way that the disparities in the HIV/AIDS crisis, which were created through the development of policy by people working inside public health institutions and in the halls of Congress, represents the model for treatment and care that we're now using to combat COVID. It's individualized. Your identity matters in an epidemic. Individual therapies are produced for profit, are the motivating force behind finding a vaccine or a cure, and criminalization will increasingly be used to organize healthy bodies from risky bodies. One stark difference between the politics of HIV and COVID is that within the first weeks of this crisis, it has been openly documented and reported that Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities are being disproportionately affected by the amount of illness and death. It took the CDC 6 years into the HIV/AIDS crisis to break down the infections of death by race. It took 6 years to get that breakdown. And in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, you saw the racial disparity of deaths grow wider as antiretroviral therapies began development. By 1996, when ART therapy was officially on the market, AIDS continued to develop in communities that lacked access to affordable health care. So in this crisis, there is less ability to gaslight. We know Black and Brown and Indigenous folks and working class communities, essential workers across the country are facing the brunt of this health crisis, just like Black and Brown communities do with HIV/AIDS and diabetes and cancer and infant and mother mortality rates and on and on and on. This pattern is not an accident. So how you understand this disparity, how you make sense of why this difference exists and seems to only get worse from every reform undergirds and is the literal backbone of your politics. You could see this disparity and understand the lives of Black and Brown working class people are shortened by the organization of our bodies in different environments and within different systems. And so when we look at the data, it is communities that lack healthcare, who are living in toxic neighborhoods, who work in the riskiest jobs without the support of a robust welfare state, who have their life chances shortened the most. In Geneva, where I teach, it's wards 5 and 6 who live in a food desert, who live in the fallout from a toxic waste of a foundry site, which the city of Geneva hid for 30 years until a movement from the community used direct action and social protest to get a remediation plan. And so from this perspective, it's the political organization of our bodies that creates these health disparities, not race. But you might interpret these sets of facts differently, as Ohio Senator Steve Huffman did just recently this summer. Seeing the racialized disparity in COVID-19, Senator Huffman asked in a hearing, and I'm quoting, "How do we know it's twice as often? Could it just be that African Americans, the colored population, do not wash their hands as well as other groups or wear a mask or do not socially distance themselves? Could it be that maybe the explanation of that's an explanation of why there's a higher incidence?" Senator Huffman is also a doctor, and this is a racist comment. This is common, I think, as Dr. Covington just pointed out in his presentation a few minutes ago. And so he's since been fired from his day job as a doctor for the statement, and there's been outrage in the community online, but most of it comes in the form of a shock that a medical doctor would interpret a racialized health disparity in terms of personal behavior and identity. But that's precisely what I found in my research over and over again on HIV to be the main priority of healthcare policy. You are responsible for your health in contemporary America, even to the point of criminalization. This is also called biological determinism, which is an ideology that scaffolds racist actions and beliefs, that genes are destiny, that indeed our obsession over the past 50 years with genetics as the key to health and identity verges towards eugenics, as sociologist Troy Duster pointed out in the 1990s with his classic book, Critiquing Scientific Practices from a Critical Race Perspective. And in his book is called Backdoor to Eugenics. Or Dorothy Roberts' books, Fatal Invention, or Harriet Washington's book, Medical Apartheid. All of those inform my own research. And in my work, I try to uncover the practices of people embedded within institutions that reflect and reproduce social inequalities, how they point resources to some communities and away from others, how they help some communities matter and they help to unmatter communities they don't see and they don't hear. For example, in the 1980s, the CDC was primarily focused on testing and investigating the spread of HIV in gay communities. They were ignoring the communities of drug users and sex workers who were outside of their surveillance capabilities and harder to isolate for institutional studies. So for over a decade, to quote an ACT UP slogan, women didn't get AIDS, they just died from it. The case definition of AIDS was narrowly tailored to the types of infections that men got when their immune systems were fully compromised. It took data from community health workers like Dr. Joyce Wallace, who took a van around New York City and tested sex workers for HIV, finding that a quarter of all sex workers in the city had the virus, years before the CDC even considered women at serious risk for HIV. It took a coalition of social movement activists and lawyers to sue the CDC to eventually force them to include things like cervical cancer in the case definition of AIDS. The difference meant disability, housing, and employment benefits. It's in these practices that I'm talking about that unmatter certain lives over others. COVID-19 shows the way in which our healthcare systems unmatter Black lives. This is the material effects of systems of labor, health, and criminal justice on marginalized communities. And so one of the political discourses that is transforming before our eyes is deeply tied to the protests we're seeing across the country and in Rochester. Part of the change we're seeing is the breakdown of this idea of biological determinism, that you're merely playing out your genetic program or that you or society have no control over. That somehow poverty and imprisonment and the police department are natural and necessary. So rather than using the passive formation that COVID disproportionately affects Black and Brown communities or higher rates of poverty or criminalization, we might better describe the situation as a consequence of our politics. We have created policy and politics that shorten the lifespans of Black and Brown communities. It is not a natural thing, but a product of human agency. COVID is exposing what political ideas are based in pure fiction, and this is one of the reasons why protesters are having such success in gaining reforms all across the nation. This is the hopeful opening that transformation offers us. AIDS activists force medical institutions to take their communities seriously. Through protest, community health research, and media campaigns, institutions like the CDC and NIH were forced to change their priorities to include marginalized people in research, testing, and policy. And finally, I want to point to some of the ideas coming out of Free the People Rochester. Last week, I went to a virtual town hall they held on policing and the public health crisis. And community leaders like Stevie Vargas and Shawnee Wilson and Melanie Funchess all spoke and pointed to the ways in which contemporary policing is a threat to public health. We see this obviously in the death of Daniel Prude, but there also was a wonderful discussion about how there can be no justice without justice for the victims themselves. And I think that's crucial to what Dr. Covington was just talking about in the hierarchy of needs, right? And in order to have that security, right, we need to feel like we are protected by our community. There can be no health or healing without that. And so justice then also becomes a necessary condition for public health, that we need to live in a society where we can seek out justice and we can feel like we are served by the institutions that stand for justice. And so thank you for your time. Those are some of my thoughts that I wanted to share with you, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation. So thank you very much.
Ricky, this is Sim. I just wanted to respond to some of the things that you put out there. The first thing I want to say is I always like to say that diversity, equity, and inclusion becomes real when it becomes personal. When people have the opportunity to other, right, and have that disconnect, when you're not humanizing someone, that creates more of an opportunity to divide and to dismiss them. The other thing I want to say is that historically in this country, there has been strategic and intentional effort to keep people out. Diversity, equity, and inclusion support strategic and intentional efforts to bring people in, right, into the conversation, into the clinical trials, as I spoke about earlier, excuse me. And I think it's important. The other thing I really want to talk about is the whole concept of psychological safety, especially when you were talking about the AIDS epidemic, and then they were automatically dismissing women, right? A lot of times for these sex workers, their clients were married men. What does that mean, right? So when people do not feel psychologically safe, which is what I started with, they are not going to tell you the truth. And when you say, well, Sim, who are you talking about? I'm talking about you, your husband, your wife, your sister, your brother, your pastor, your lawyer, fill in the blank. When people do not feel psychologically safe, they are not going to tell you the truth, no matter what segment of life they're coming from. And that includes a person who may be dealing with some type of mental illness or mental diagnosis. It's very important to have those conversations. I'm very happy that you brought up the politician who made the horrible remark relevant to individuals who are coming from the African American diverse communities dealing with COVID-19, because it was another opportunity to dismiss, right? It's an opportunity to dismiss systematic issues in this country. It's an opportunity to automatically communicate the whole concept of operator error, right? Something that's very unique at Finger Lakes Community College, which I communicate to our campus leadership, including the Board of Trustees, is the following. As we are looking to address matters of diversity, equity, inclusion, and bring more students to a predominantly white institution from diverse backgrounds, i.e. Rochester, New York City, et cetera, right? For a lot of our students, our campus is their first time being exposed to other. Why do I share that? To not expect conflict is pretty naive. They've never been around each other. They've had 17 to 18 to 19, and if we have non-traditional students, 40 plus years of programming, never having access to other, whatever other may be, right, relevant to those social identities. And now our campus is the first time they're either roommates with other, they're in class with other, right, interacting with somebody of a different religion. Everyone is not, a lot of times when people think about mental illness, which is what I spoke about, people automatically assume that people are going to keep that private. That's not necessarily true. You may have some people who are very open and willing to talk about living with mental illness, and now other people become uncomfortable. Why? When your implicit bias comes up, what do you do with that discomfort? And I think it's very important that people explore that in regards to their own work that they do as they navigate forward.
Wow. Let me just say that the both of y'all, that was amazing and kind of a lot, which is great, right? Because dropping knowledge bombs is just like the kind of thing that I love to have in a conversation. And Ricky, I really love how you correlated COVID with the HIV/AIDS. It's something that, you know, my cousin died of AIDS, and he didn't live to see, you know, the great medicines, et cetera, that we have right now. So to bring those correlations, because there's many in the LGBTQ community who are, you know, the lost generation as kids who lost, you know, so many, right? And we grew up in that. And this is a triggering moment, right? So I really appreciate you highlighting how the policies, right? The body is political, right? And how these policies are impacting us. It's not being Black, it's not being LGBTQ, it's these policies, these systems, these attitudes. So thank you for bringing that. And wow, I'm gonna need those slides, Sim. I think everyone's gonna need those slides.
Definitely.
That was so, I hope people were watching because and taking furious notes. And shout out to the captionists for getting you perfect. I've been watching. So thank you to whoever's captioning this, because like this is amazing, amazing knowledge. So thank you for that. We do have some questions, and because I don't think they were ready for y'all. So I'm going to read some of them, and just as the spirit moves you and calls you to answer, I'm not going to like single anybody out because no one singled you out yet in the questions. So I want to get to that. So the first question is, how many police departments include as part of the professional staff a trained or certified mental health professional? And then there's the second part to this. Is this something we can demand of our local officials to include in municipal budgets?
So in regards to the first part of the question, how many police departments include as part of the professional staff a trained or certified professional? To give you a direct answer, I don't know, because I don't want to misspeak, right? A lot of times for law enforcement in regards to the mental health professional, it would be typically for them to receive services themselves, as opposed to the person being a part of the staff in regards to providing training to help them navigate the world at large. I think that by default of the national climate, which is typically going to be reflected on the local level, that can be the impetus to start these conversations with your local officials, right? You can speak to people in city council to talk about what type of training, for example, in Canandaigua, they started, the city manager under the director of the governor has started a police reform committee. These are the conversations that we are having. These are the conversations that are going to take place. I will say that a lot of times, if you want to follow any type of real commitment, all you have to do is follow the money, right? Because when you follow money, you can see what's being prioritized. And a lot of times, if the budget isn't there, that's going to create a platform where people can say, well, we can't afford that. So though you may not be able to afford a full-time health professional, an alternative would be to bring in people to provide the training, which means they don't have to necessarily be on payroll. You don't have to pay salary plus benefits, but you can pay an honorarium to bring them in periodically to have these conversations with officers in regards to what this can look like as they're dealing with the general public. Ricky, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, I also don't have any specifics on that, but my hunch is that would vary very differently by state and municipality. But it's definitely a very interesting question to look at. And then I would just echo what Sim's just saying. I'm not as familiar as what's happening in Canandaigua. In Geneva, the People's Peaceful Protest has been organizing all summer, and the city council is looking at a police accountability board in Geneva. They've gotten a lot of help from the police accountability folks in Rochester, and there's been a lot of great sharing of ideas. And so I think, yes, ideally, in our small communities in rural central New York, there's lots of possibility to transform the way that policing looks, and we certainly do that through budgets and priorities. So I think getting involved in local politics is one of the most important and influential things you can do as an individual person.
The other thing that I was going to say is I think that, once again, if you're looking at the national landscape, this creates an opportunity for all communities to be proactive versus reactive, right? Anytime you watch Dateline NBC, right, I just want to use this as an example, you always hear the standard line, oh, that doesn't happen here, right? But guess what? It just happened. So it's not a matter of what happened, it's a matter of when. Right? So how can you be proactive? Given what's going on in the national climate, the national climate can be the impetus to facilitate the conversations with your local officials, right? So if we have, let's use Canandaigua, which is not necessarily very diverse when it comes to race, right? But regardless of us not being very diverse when it comes to race, we are, one time the city manager was letting me know how many cars go up and down Main Street, and we have people coming in from all different areas, right? So to call it like it is, if a white officer gets in some type of infraction with an individual, what type of training is this officer engaging in? And the only reason I said white officer is because of the national narrative, but it can be any officer, right? If they get in some type of interaction with someone, what type of engagement or training are they engaging in? If they're engaging with somebody from the LGBT community, a perfect example of this in regards to systematic bias is relevant to the transgender community, right? So if a person presents physically one way, but their pronouns is different based on versus their gender expression, what's going to happen in that moment? What's going to happen? So what type of training is taking place to combat bias that may exist, and how can you work with your local officials to bring mental health aspects into the conversation?
Thank you for that. And just an added kind of comment is that most municipalities follow the same sort of budget cycle, July 1st through June 30th. So, but the time to have those conversations actually happens around now. So somewhere in between October, before the last session before Thanksgiving, which is in November, is when your departments, et cetera, will start to begin to look at their budgets and developing their plans. So we usually in the city of Rochester do engagement in January and February. I think that's too late. It should be now is when we start engaging people, particularly those who are from marginalized communities, because we don't like to be surveyed. So it's a harder, longer engagement, and most don't have the kind of budget in order to get that deep level of engagement. So now is the time to have those conversations. Your elected officials are also going to be going through an election year next year for many municipalities. So now is like the time to get in, talk to them, vote. That is, if you haven't registered, please do.
That's right.
Your friendly public servant asking you to please vote. But these are the ways that you can engage, right? And the more engagement that you have with your elected officials, the more that you are going to your council meetings, neighborhood meetings, etc., the more that you're uplifting and bringing in other people. Maybe there's someone you can give a ride. I don't know. These are suggestions, but the more that you're engaged, the more that you're going to be up to date about what it is that is going on. And the budget book is the Bible for all municipalities. And learn to read it and understand it, talk to people, and that's going to help you with your advocacy moving forward. So I know I'm not a panelist, but I had to say.
But what you're saying is excellent. I think in regards to what's going on in Rochester, another way that you can put it, if you do not invest in the community, you cannot expect the community to invest in you. Unfortunately, a lot of times the investment happens through a level of activism as a result of some type of tragedy. But the bottom line is, I think that communities can learn, right, and be proactive in regards to moving themselves forward.
Great. So we have another question. And this one is a little bit long. So it says, it seems like the rise of special interest groups are the cause of much systemic racism. Instead of creating organizations to work within the current system, would universal forms of higher education and healthcare move us closer and more efficiently towards a less racist, more inclusive system? And there's a second part. If so, why does there seem to be so much focus on influencing special interests that have been historically resistant?
Well, my initial response to that is in regards to universal, I think that, in my opinion, in regards to universal, it would have to be mapped out strategically, right? So in regards to changing the current system, you're going to have to deal with what's currently in place. And if you're going to break that down, what is that breakdown going to look like in order to change to a new model? If we have, for example, looking at the question, universal healthcare and universal higher education, which was very much so the platform of some of the people who were running for president, what is that going to look like? What cost is that going to come out? How is that going to impact taxes? And I think that needs to be a greater discussion. I do think that before that proposal is dismissed, because a lot of people are like, well, that's never going to happen. That's never going to happen. That's never going to happen. I think before such a proposal is dismissed, I think that equity would imply and inclusion would imply providing a seat at the table where people can present their case in regards to moving things forward most effectively.
Yeah, and I think if I'm reading this question correctly, I'm sort of interpreting special interest groups to be sort of a reference to maybe pharmaceutical companies or private health insurance. So one of the things that your question makes me think of is that one of the things that is a perennial question in health policy studies is, why is universal health care such a difficult thing to try to accomplish in America? whereas it's become the norm in so many other countries all across the world, right? And so what are the structural issues, or what are the reasons that are particular to the way that our government is built that prevents us from having something like that? And so one of the things we do find, right, is that because we are so dependent on private health insurance in the way that healthcare is structured in America, that that is always a huge obstacle, right? Because if you tell people we're getting rid of your private health insurance, right, that is something that people get nervous about, right? But then also it shows to how large a sector of employment private health insurance is as well. So, so when you're talking about transformational change, like universal healthcare or something like that, then you have to uproot a lot of things that a lot of people rely on, either for economic reasons or ideological reasons, or reasons of comfort. And so that's always like really, really uncomfortable in thinking about change. But I think, yes, the effect would be if everyone had healthcare that was equal and equitable in its distribution and access, which is even difficult with a universal healthcare model, then yes, the system would be less racist and more inclusive. And that would be something I would definitely encourage it moving towards. But it's obviously something presidents have talked about for over 100 years now.
The other thing that I was going to say is when you're having such a discussion, there is also an undercurrent of power dynamics, right? When you talk about these special interest groups, that they're operating from a position of power, right? They're not going to give that power up very easily, right? And for the individuals, if we're thinking about the world of have and have nots, the working class versus the bourgeoisie, right? Shout out to Madonna. If you're taking all of that into consideration, what's going on in my mind is the individuals who are coming from a higher power dynamic is not going to give that up. They are not going to want to give up their turf. They are not going to want to give up their money, their resources. They are not going to give up their stance or their stake in the game. So I think that once again, it's very important when you're having this conversation, when we're talking about universal healthcare, universal higher education, that may be coming from a stance of empathy, right? Having empathy for others and making this universal for others. But everyone is not going to operate with that same level of empathy. Thus, these special interest groups are going to want to stay in power. So once again, I think it's very important to be strategic in regards to what that should look like. And I think I won't say easy, but as it becomes complex, I think a great study would be to look at the people who push back against those proposals, look at what they come up with, and then think about how you can combat anything they do to deflect moving that forward.
Great. Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
So next we have a comment. This is for all the attendees. Apparently there are 2 public forums in Canandaigua next week to discuss police reform initiatives locally. Please encourage, everyone, please go. It's September 21st, 6:30 p.m. at the Salvation Army, and September 23rd, 6:30 p.m., Fort Hill Performing Arts Theater. Thank you to the person who made that comment.
We are very excited about that. And we are also going to be creating an online platform where people can also talk about their experience with Canandaigua Police, because people may not always feel comfortable sharing that in an open forum. And we wanted to be sensitive to that as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Well,
our next question is, what actions are in place to diversify Canandaigua or Geneva police departments?
Good question. Listen, I'm so excited somebody asked that question, because the number one thing I heard since I got here is the following. Let me get out of Dr. Covington and let y'all meet Sim. The number one thing, while our department is reflective of the community in which we reside, get out of here. Right? So once again, as I said earlier, diversity, equity, inclusion becomes real when it becomes personal. Historically in this country, there has been systems and policies and practices to keep people out. What are you doing to bring people in? Now, the first thing I'm going to say is I understand that for a lot of this is civil service exams. Okay, what are you doing to increase the diversity of the individuals who are taking the test? Rochester right there, they had the 64 riots. There's huge history here where you can recruit people from diverse backgrounds. And I think that there needs to be strategies to operate with a level of intentionality. If you keep practicing the status quo, you're going to always get what you always have, right? So what are you doing to actually change your practice in order to bring more diversity in? So since working at FLCC, I'm very happy to say within 1 year of my hire, we increased diversity applicants by 50%. Within 1 year, right? So I'm going to be having conversations with the chief in Canandaigua in regards to some strategies that they can incorporate, right? But it's also very important to talk about very quickly this concept of what's called co-optation. And co-optation means the following. A lot of agencies will bring on diversity, but there's no inclusion. And the reason they bring on diversity is to deflect from the fact that they actually engage in systematic racist practices, right? So they'll have quote unquote a token there so they can be like, oh, we're not racist, we got such and such and such, right? That person don't have no power, that person doesn't have a voice, they're treated with total disrespect. But if anybody pushes back on the agency, they can talk about the token that they have working from whatever aspects of social identity, primarily race. So in regards to Canandaigua, I don't want to speak for the police chief, but we will be having conversations in regards to different strategies that they can incorporate. Also, I'm processing when it comes to interviewing, what strategies are in place to combat implicit bias during the interview process, which is also very important. What are you doing to make sure that individuals feel welcome and they can actually be themselves? The last comment I'll make is this. I think that if you put real out there, you have to be ready for a real response. I think a huge myth when it comes to diversity work, I'm going to say this slow, a huge myth when it comes to diversity work is that a lot of times when a person is engaging in an infraction, there's always this misconception that, oh, they just didn't know no better. That's not true. There's always this mindset that some type of infraction happens at the organization, the institution. Oh, we need to bring in a speaker. One-off programming is not going to be the answer to systematic issues. So you need to make sure that you're operating continuously in order to address whatever you're looking to address, and you also need to set up a culture of accountability that's genuine. Ricky, I'll throw it to you.
I mean, you hit so many of the points so well. I mean, same issues in Geneva. And I think one of the problems is, well, I think one thing that folks are talking about, right, that they're also talking about in Buffalo and Rochester, right? I think you may already have this in Rochester, I'm not sure, but the community model where folks have to, along the police department, have to be from that community, right? So that's one way to think about it, but that also has its own limitations. And so I think the question is, how do you make on one level, how do you make the police department reflect the community that it's from? And I think there are community models for that. But then I think the other big issue, right, is, and again, I want to take a note from you, Sim, and think about diversity in a lot of different ways. And so I think when I think about diversifying the police department, I think about how can we diversify the way that the community has control or accountability over what the police department does, right? And so that would be another way to diversify the department, is by giving the community more voice over the policies and accountability of police departments. I think then you would most likely get interactions, or hopefully we get interactions that would both be reflective of the folks that are living in the community, and they would also include their voices in a way that's really powerful, beyond, obviously making sure that the folks who work for the city reflect that city.
So we don't have a mandate for our officers to be from our areas that's controlled by the state law, Taylor law.
Did Buffalo pass something like that recently, though, or were they working towards that? There's something I felt like somewhere near here did that, but
I think
yeah. Anyway,
was a move in Buffalo to make that happen. I don't know if that is concrete because that goes through, the union. There's barriers.
Right. Well, and if you're saying it's a state thing, then probably not, right?
So cities can petition, but that is the final decision, I believe, is up to the state. So that That was an amazing, we have so many questions, so I just limit our speakers to like maybe like a minute or two. And also like breathe. Breathing is good. And giving our captions a little bit of time to like catch up. Because
Sorry.
that
Yeah.
was good. Thank you, captionists. So they're caught up right now. So our next question is, what are the costs of not providing universal health care? And maybe, Ricky, I'll give that one to you.
I mean, I don't know the exact numbers off the top of my head, but I know that, right, if we invested money on preventative care and providing folks with all the material needs that they need to thrive and survive, emergency costs would go down, surgeries would go down, right? So I think there's broad data, overwhelmingly, at least in the discipline of political science, that universal healthcare is much, much, much cheaper broadly, although it may not be cheaper, right, on an individual level for some people. And that's sort of what always happens in America, is you have that sort of debate about individual liberty versus the collective good. So sharing all of the healthcare costs, it eases the burden for us all generally.
All right, this is a long question. Can you speak about the criminalization of mental health and the degree to which larger systems are geared in addressing mental health issues via the criminal justice system? In the most recent events in Rochester, Strong Hospital was identified as releasing Mr. Prude instead of holding him for treatment. This is more common than not due to lack of emergency mental health services, and more often than not, people end up in jail rather than the hospital where they need to be.
I think that there are two things that I'm intentionally talking slower for the scribes. So I want to be cognizant of your requests. I think that, in my opinion, there are two things that's contributing to that. The first thing, in my opinion, would be implicit bias. So because of a lack of empathy, the mental health status of the individual is never even assessed, or it's dismissed, right? They're only going to be focused on the behavior. And I think as a result of that, as I mentioned earlier, especially when you start this in the K through 12 system, there's already the situation where these individuals are in the system because law enforcement have a stronger presence, right? And then that follows them into adulthood. So that's the first thing. The other thing that I was going to say is, as I speak to some people who work in law enforcement, they have shared with me, even if they show up to a mental health response and they take the person to said hospital, if the person is of a certain age, long story short, they can refuse service, right? And I think the challenge with that is the hospital staff, the people who are working in the profession may have whatever number of cases coming through the door, right? If we're having a real conversation. So the demand may be very high for their service, and the individual may be responding in a way where they refuse service. So they're gonna be like, all right, they put them back on the street. In regards to an evaluative metric where, regardless of the fact that the person is refusing service, they can be mandated to stay, I think that can become a human rights issue, right? And I think it becomes very complex, especially if the person at the time of evaluation isn't necessarily exhibiting symptoms that will bring things into question. So prior to working in higher ed, working in the mental health field, I worked in a house for individuals who were dealing with severe psychiatric disorders, i.e. schizophrenia. So if a person was showing symptoms of dealing with hallucinations, auditory or visual, while they're going through an evaluation, that may be enough for the mental health provider to mandate that they stay. But this is so important, especially when it comes to us having a conversation around mental health and diversity, equity, and inclusion. Please be advised that you have a lot of people who may have some type of mental health diagnosis, but may very much so be high functioning individuals. There is very much so that by default of a mental health diagnosis, that you are going to automatically look or operate a certain way. This, in the extreme sense, would be when people think of the boogeyman, right? When they think of the boogeyman, they think of something scary, this, that, and the other. History has shown us that you may have individuals who may be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. They're extremely high functioning. They can be handsome, they can be beautiful, and they can have the gift of gab. Part of the diagnosis is that they're glib and superficial. So just because you have a diagnosis, once again, that may cause some of these mental health providers to put these individuals back on the street. Ricky, anything?
No, I mean, again, Sim, you hit so much of it. I think just reading Catherine's question here, again, I feel like you sort of have the answer yourself. I don't think I have to add much to it, right? You say that, right, that this is more common than not due to lack of emergency medical health services, right? So we know that there's nowhere to go in that situation, and the places you do call have a high amount of risk. And so I think you're identifying right there in your question a huge flaw in our current system of care.
So I think it's also important, because I think Sim has been touching on this, is about ableism, which is when the default is set to non-disabled bodies, right? And so that gap comes from when disabled people were institutionalized. We had Willowbrook, which was awful. People were chained to their beds. They weren't getting the kind of care that they needed. They were walking around or just sitting in their own feces and urine. And thanks to Geraldo Rivera, right, being able to shine a light on that and make advocates shining a light on that. So then these institutions were closed. However, you close all the institutions, but you don't provide a plan on what to happen with folk, on how to help them. Community-based care is one of the tenets of the disability justice movement, and saying that we have the right to be cared for within our own communities and not sent to institutions. But that is not valued, even though it's actually cost less to the state and Medicaid in order to provide that level of care and service. On top of that, the type of practitioners that you need, whether they are Black, Brown, ESL, ASL, right? All these different ways that people show up with mental illnesses, particularly those who are physically disabled. We can't access the psychiatric emergency room, right? They take your wheelchair away. And so that's going to cause psychiatric trauma by taking the very thing that gives you independence. So it is complex and multi-layered, but starts with these policies. And I think that started with good intentions, right? We can't institutionalize people against their own will. This is why you have the right to refuse treatment, because of the historical context. It's not just with disabled people. We've done this to Black people, right? The idea that a slave wanted to run away was seen as quote unquote crazy. Like, why would they want to run away, right? And so you would force people into some sort of slavery and institution against their will. So all of this has historical background and the fabric of this country, and that disability aspect often gets lost in the conversation, right? And I just want to make sure that we're also kind of thinking about that on that different level. So yes, disabled people argued for the right to refuse, argued for the right to bodily autonomy, but what happens when you are in need of help and assistance? What is that line that needs to be crossed for a practitioner to say, you know, I know this is in your best interest to stay here, and how do you not do that without getting into some really funky human rights issues, because
Yes.
that does happen. It's happened. Like the guy who Cards Against Humanity, that was a human rights violation. He was incarcerated, basically institutionalized in the psychiatric ward by his white coworkers because he started talking about racism at the job. So understand that, and people use their white privilege and power in order to get him in a 72-hour hold, right? So imagine if you can do that to one person, what happens if we allow that to happen on a wider scale. So that, yeah.
I'm sorry. I want to just say two things. The first thing I want to say is, even with the individuals who we have right here on the screen, I think that what we have going on right now reinforces the importance of inclusion, right? I think ego creates a platform where people think they know it all. I don't know everything. I promise you that, right? Though I love C-SPAN, I don't have training in political science. I should be having a conversation with Ricky, right? So though I won the Student Service Excellence Award from the library at SUNY Albany, Alexis, that's what she do for. I share this to say, when you have inclusion, you can bring other stakeholders to the table that can help you. It's distributive leadership that can help you create the best outcome, and also help you recognize things that may be missing. I got on my platform, I forgot my second thought. If it come back, I'll let you know.
Keep on preaching on. So we've got a question. It says, I have read that sometime in the 1950s, racism was designated a form of mental illness. Can Sim or Ricky confirm or clarify this designation? Thank you.
I'm not familiar with it being designated as a form of mental illness. So I don't want to misspeak. I can definitely see where systems would be in place where if a person was fighting against racism, where they would designate that as some form of mental illness, because once again, you have power structures that are being challenged, right? When you're challenging the status quo, any type of thing that is going to undermine your mental status is going to once again create a platform where they vilify you, right? So that's the only familiarity that I have with that. And I don't want to just automatically jump on a bandwagon and misspeak. Ricky, do you know anything relevant to that?
No, this is definitely outside of health policy, right? This would probably be in if you're talking about the diagnostic manual of illnesses, right, and psychological diseases. I don't know, Letitia, have you heard of anything like this before? I certainly haven't.
All I know is that Black people calling out racism was deemed a mental illness. And that's been not from the 50s, that goes back into when they enslaved Africans trying to flee. They would label them as mentally, we use words like mentally disturbed, but that's not what they used back then. But that is actually huge in the South as well. That's where my family is from. So Black people be labeled as crazy, etc., for speaking up about issues of race, and that they could actually put you in jail, throw you into a mental institution, etc.
Oh, I remember my thought. One of the things that I always say is the following, because sometimes when you're having these conversations in certain circles, you get pushback, right? So what's very big in higher education is moving from theory to practice, right? So as opposed to us continuing to have this conversation, if there's anybody who's questioning what I'm talking about, I want you to go with me in the local community, and let's go from, so for those of you who are not familiar with Canandaigua, we have a strip here called 5 and 20, and on 5 and 20, we have what's called, we have from Lowe's all the way to Shepherd Ford. That's on 5 and 20, but I just use Canandaigua because it's pretty homogenous. And the challenge that I give people is, as opposed to us continuing to talk about this, because according to your perspective, implicit bias and discrimination doesn't exist, let's move from theory to practice. And I want you to go with me across the street and let's walk into all these stores. And every stores we walk in, I want you to be holding my hand. And if your experience with me is similar to what you would have if you were, for lack of a better word, operating solo, then I'll digress. Guess how many people took me up on my offer? 0. So that says to me, you know there's an issue, you just don't want to live in it. But people who are coming from certain diverse, marginalized background, I don't have that choice. You have the luxury of not living in it. Right? And it's important to have these conversations. So why am I bringing this up? What happens when I show up to blank, blank, blank's office or blank, blank, blank's restaurant may be very different from when you show up, just by default of comfort level, right? And by default of that comfort level or lack thereof, that's going to play itself out in people's interactions. So, you know, it's not limited to law enforcement. I know that's the platform that we see by default of everything that's happening in the national climate, but there's plenty of times where people bump into certain forms of discrimination. And then if you're constantly dealing with discrimination on a regular basis, it's going to have an impact on what? Your mental health. That's a given. If you're constantly being marginalized every day, day in and day out, you can't be yourself, or you're punished rather for being yourself. That's going to have severe consequences. And I know earlier I referenced cognitive bandwidth, and that's very important.
That is a lot, again, but truth, right? And the same goes for, you know, ableism, etc. The built environment can cause psychological harm if you can't physically get around. Social isolation for disabled people is a thing. It's been a thing, right? Because the built environment doesn't allow you to access friends' home, family home, recreational activities. So the suicide and depression rates for physically disabled people is actually quite high. And it's not because of the disability, it's because of the environment and the attitudes that people get, right? And so we can think about this time in quarantine. Many people who were disabled were angry, and rightfully so. Many of the accessibility features, et cetera, that they have wanted, particularly remote work, right? Finally, everyone who had said no is saying yes, because non-disabled people want that level of access, right? And we can suddenly give it to one group, right, but not the other that was marginalized. And what that caused for many people, sadness, depression, right? All sorts of mental health issues came out of that and still are occurring with many people, right? So thinking about how you function in an environment that's built for you, you don't notice it, right? So what that does psychologically for many people, some cities were built with hostile intent. Los Angeles is like a key example of that, where the whole entire city is designed to prevent homeless people from sleeping on benches, accessing certain areas, etc. And so if the built environment is intentionally built in a way to exclude people, what does that do to people that you're excluding, right? And so we say that this is not by default, right? It's with intention. And Ricky, you know, talked about that. These are intentional policies that are being enacted by certain groups who might have a special interest. I really don't like that word. I don't really know what that means to certain people. So a special interest, not my special interest. So, you know, when you talk about these things and how folk are actually creating policies, this is why the R.E.A.L initiative was created, to be able to say, well, many of these happen in the seat of government, right? And so we have to look at our policies, practices, and procedures. I didn't start the fire, right? But it is my responsibility as a government worker to put the fire out. And if I'm not doing my due diligence in order to do that, then I'm not abiding by, you know, what is good and right for my constituents, right? And that is the way a civil servant should behave. I'm not going to say that we all are behaving in that sort of way, but that is actually the mandate of civil servant law. So when we think about what government should do, right, and how it should behave, how it should be responsive, it's got to look internally first. And that was our initial goal, right? I can't be pointing fingers at anybody. And, you know, I got a telephone pole in my own eye, right? We have to start looking at ourselves. And that's also what Michael Jackson told us to do. So we should also abide by those rules.
That's right.
The man in the mirror. Like,
That's
if
right.
you look at yourself, like,
That's
I
right.
change, right? That is really what the initiative is all about, is saying, as government, what have we done? How do we educate our workers? We had people in zoning and planning who did not know what redlining was, and how we were actually still abiding by redlining policies, even though redlining was mandated, like it's illegal, but we're still doing it, right? Green light, which everyone loves, fast internet, goes by red line maps. That's how they decide where they're going to put certain high-speed internet into certain neighborhoods. So by default, businesses are also intentionally using these antiquated, you know, racist ideas that are then now kind of, we're seeing that today, right? So that divestment, looking at, you know, why certain neighborhoods are built certain ways, you know, why, how is your home? Did you know that there's no law across the United States of America that says that you need stairs into a home? But yet every house, you know, and they got the weird garage with the giant step that nobody, it's too big and too short at the same time. Why?
Right.
That's not required by law. So why would the built environment include something that is unnecessary, right? It's because people aren't thinking about who is going to use that space.
That's right.
We have to really think about, we are complicit and active in these decisions as well. Nothing is passive, right? We have to take a more active stance in how we're combating all these different things within our lives, because we're not, you know, folks in some petri dish just passively having stuff happen to us. We make decisions, right? Everybody makes a decision, thousands of decisions in a day, right? But what if those decisions are also leading to more marginalization of people? So this is what I hope, like these conversations over these next few days, you know, people start an awakening, I hope, and then leading to action, because thought without action is just a daydream. Daydreams are nice, but they don't really lead to much of anything. And so instead of being some daydreamers, right, we need to be now and now, act now, right? What can you do now? So with our time that's left, I want to kind of lead the floor to each one of you. What is that call to action that you want people to have for these like this topic of mental health? What can people take with them and say, now, what do I do?
One of the things that I would encourage people to do is to operate with a level of intentionality and to get actively involved in their community, right? Don't be a passive bystander. As I mentioned Dateline NBC earlier, that doesn't happen here. That doesn't happen here. It does happen here, right? So I would encourage people to be proactive versus reactive. As we mentioned, we had a person mention the fact that we have these community forums coming up relevant to people's interaction with law enforcement. If you have something that you would like to share, positive or negative, we would love for you to become active citizens in your community. You have a voice, so the main thing I would encourage people to do is to take the time to use your voice and create a platform to create change.
I guess first and foremost, the way I sort of go into this work is, I think evidenced by this conversation tonight, like I want to keep learning, and I've learned so much from all of you this evening. So I think that's first and foremost how I think about it. how do I continue learning and growing as a human being, right? And so what sort of self work do I need to be doing constantly? Once you become aware, right, of your biases, that's one thing, right? But I think as Sim has talked about all night, it is a constant set of work because it is a type of socialization. And then beyond that, right, as a political scientist, what I try to do in my own personal life and what I try to tell my students do, regardless of where they fall on the political spectrum, it's that connections with people matter, right? And that if you are only interested in a politics that serves yourself, then you will end up with a politics that is, it doesn't extend beyond yourself either. And so I think about what are the ways in your everyday life that you can create solidarity with people who are different than you? And there's a lot of practical ways to think about doing that. But for me, I think that is a sort of general ethic about how I think about my research and my work, is how am I reaching people who I normally wouldn't, and how am I trying to listen to people who I would normally not talk to? And then from that, there's so many options in this beautiful, vibrant area of the world that we live in. So many examples from history, right? From the Haudenosaunee Great Law of Peace to Frederick Douglass's North Star, to Harriet Tubman, to the folks marching in Rochester today, right? And so I think, I think to try to be inspired by those voices from the past and the folks in the present who are doing the work, and I think there's plenty of examples there's plenty of examples and a lot of work to do, I think is where I would leave it.
Wow, thank you so much, everybody. Alexis, do you have any kind of closing words for us? I feel like I've talked a lot, so I'm gonna give that to you.
No, I just want to thank everyone for joining us tonight for this discussion. And if you did not register for the next 2 days in the series, you still have time. And we would love to see you back tomorrow night at 7 o'clock.
Yeah, our speakers tomorrow are going to be just as awesome and just as prepared as R2. I think like this has just been really great, and I just want to thank y'all for your time. I am so, Ricky, I've never met you in my entire life, and I hope to continue a conversation with you, even like
Me too.
You're awesome. Thank you, Sim. It's good to see you again in these Rona streets, like doing your thing. I really appreciate you, and Alexis, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you soon. See you tomorrow.
Thank you, Ricky. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Have a good night.